Okay, hi everyone. So we're going to talk about revision today, and I'm going to use Raymond Carver's story. We're going to look at what we talk about when we talk about love by Raymond Carver, the story you should have read. So if you've not read this story yet, go back and read it before you watch this video, because you'll have more context for what we're going to talk about as we look at this story. Okay, so just for a bit of background, Raymond Carver is probably one of the most famous realistic fiction writers of this century and or of the 20th century, actually, I should say. Died fairly young, but he had a very famous editor named Gordon Lish, who was also a writer in his own right. And Gordon Lish did some very heavy editing on Raymond Carver. So in fact, there is now an anthology for purchase, and it has both the original stories by Carver and those edited by Lish. And you can see that some of his stories, some of the stories he's most famous for actually are maybe a third of what their original size was after they were edited by Lish. So I'm going to just take a close look at the original story, and I've marked up in yellow what is original and what so it was taken out. And the story that you're reading is the revised one that Lish helped to revise, that he edited. And I think he did a phenomenal job with that particular story editing, with what we talk about when we talk about love in his edits. And you will also hear Sherman Alexie in the podcast for this week talking about another Raymond Carver story. So you're going to get a lot of Raymond Carver this week, but he is a very interesting writer to look at. I mean, probably one of the most influential writers on sort of the realist American short story of the 20th century. So let's look at this. This is the very beginning of what we talk about when we talk about love. And it starts out with my friend Herb McGinnis, a cardiologist, was talking. That's the original, okay? My friend Herb McGinnis, a cardiologist, was talking. The four of us were sitting around his kitchen table drinking gin. It was a Saturday afternoon, okay? That's how the original reads. Lish took out what's in yellow and put in what's in bold. My friend Mel was talking. Mel McGinnis is a cardiologist, and sometimes that gives him the right. And then made a new paragraph. So that's all in one paragraph, those first two lines there. The four of us were sitting around his kitchen table drinking gin. Okay, so what have we done here? Well, he's changed the name, right? So we get a much more mellifluous, no pun intended there, Mel McGinnis. We also get my friend Mel was talking, and now we get Mel McGinnis is a cardiologist, and sometimes that gives him the right. All of a sudden, what was not there before is dynamic, right? We get a relationship between Mel and this narrator. And boy, this narrator has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder against Mel, right? We also get class. We get the sense that Mel is of a superior class, or, richer than the narrator, okay? And that the narrator thinks that Mel is full of himself, basically, all right? All of that is suddenly in what basically is not many more words, right? The stakes are embedded in this one line here that's been added. Okay, and again, not many more words because Lish has taken out a few words as well. Then we get a new paragraph, so there's more emphasis, because every time you have a paragraph, right, you get more emphasis on whatever that last and first line are. So you only have two lines here, so that both the first and the last line are getting a lot of emphasis. The four of us were sitting around his kitchen table drinking gin, and he takes up, it was a Saturday afternoon, because that sort of takes us away from the immediacy of what's going on here. Okay, so Lish takes that out. All right, revising for voice. Now watch what he does with voice here. Sunlight filled the kitchen from the big window behind the sink. There were Herb and I and his second wife, Teresa, Terry we called her, and my wife, Laura. We lived in Albuquerque, but we were all from somewhere else. This is what Lish does. Sunlight filled the kitchen from the big window behind the sink. There were Mel and me and his second wife, Teresa, Terry we called her, and my wife, Laura. We lived in Albuquerque then, but we were all from somewhere else. Listen to the difference. Okay. First of all, he makes it non-grammatical. So Herb and I is correct, right? Or Mel and I, however it's not about the name, it's about the I there, the nominative. He makes it Mel and me. Why? This narrator most likely would not be saying I in this case, right? He'd be much more colloquial. So he puts in that colloquialism. And then we lived in Albuquerque then. All of a sudden, we get a temporal relationship in the story, okay? And we also get this voice that's telling us, sort of like, come sit down, let me tell you a story about what a time in my life, okay? But we were all from somewhere else. And again, the emphasis then is on the but, which is the first word. And so it's as though all these people were from elsewhere, came together for a moment in time, and then dispersed again. And remember, the title is What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. So, maybe there was love once and then it's gone. Here we have an emphasis on the character dynamics. Okay, new paragraph. Lish has put in this paragraph. So when you're reading this story, you see that there are many paragraphs, whereas the original did not have that many paragraphs. There was an ice bucket on the table. The gin and the tonic water kept going around, and we somehow got on the subject of love. Herb thought real love was nothing less than spiritual love. When he was young, he'd spent 5 years in a seminary before quitting to go to medical school. He left the church at the same time, but he still looked back to those years in the seminary as the most important in his life. The changes, there was an ice bucket on the table. The gin and tonic water kept going around, and we somehow got on the subject of love. Mel thought real love was nothing less than spiritual love. He said he'd spent 5 years in the seminary before quitting to go to medical school. He left the church at the same time, but he said he still looked back on those years in the seminary as the most important in his life. Okay. By weaving in that he said and the repetition of he said, and usually, you'll see me say, oh, don't repeat here, don't repeat there. But Carver's doing this very intentionally, that he said. It is undercutting Mel's authority, right? He said, but Mel might be a liar, right? We don't trust Mel. The narrator doesn't trust Mel. The narrator, has a beef with Mel. Friend or no friend, he's got something on him, against him. So he doesn't quite believe him. And that is now embedded here, whereas it was not before. And then looking at the pacing here. Terry said the man she lived with before she lived with Herb loved her so much he tried to kill her. Herb laughed after she said this. He made a face. Terry looked at him. Then she said, he beat me up one night, the last night we lived together. Okay, so instead we get Mel loved her so much. Terry said the man she lived with before she lived with Mel loved her so much he tried to kill her. And there's a change here too. Mel laughed after she said this. He made a face. Terry looked at him. Then Terry said, he beat me up one night, the last night we lived together. Okay, so we get this repetition of the names in this that just keeps recalling us to these two people and their dynamic. And we get the pacing. There's not a lot of change here, but this is one thing Carver does really beautifully, is we get subject, verb, object, and there's a pacing that sort of replicates the very, I don't want to say boring, but the not very imaginative mindset of the narrator. Okay, so this is not a narrator who is greatly creative or imaginative or empathic even, right? And it is the pacing of the text that replicates some of that, even though Carver himself is greatly imaginative, obviously, and creative. But in rendering this particular character and the way in which he thinks, he's using this pacing in a very deliberate manner. Okay, so as you're revising your own story, think about, does the first line engage us through its voice, right? If you can engage us in voice, that's half the battle, right? If we want to hear this character talking, you got something there. Are the stakes high? So you notice that in Carver's story, the stakes are high right off the bat, right after it's been edited. Are the relationships between the characters clear, and is there tension that is not being spelled out? So we have that tension between Mel and the narrator, and we are not ever told that, oh, the narrator thinks he's not quite as good as Mel, or maybe he's scared that Mel looks down on him, or that there's a class difference, or any of that, right? We're getting it through just the way in which he words his sentences. Does the pacing created through punctuation reflect the way the characters think and feel? Okay, so again, are they short staccato sentences? Is it they're longer, more meandering ones? Thinking about pacing, but it should really relieve you that somebody as great a writer as Carver, when you read the original, does not have in it all that Lish was able to get out in his own in his edits. So that should be something that actually makes you feel like, we're all in this together, right? Even the greatest writers struggle with the issues that we're discussing in class. All right, happy writing.